At my retirement party, my daughter-in-law was wearing my dress. I knew she was my husband's mistress. At that moment, I pulled out an envelope that took everyone's breath away. My husband opened it with trembling hands. And on the very first line, he realized he had lost everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never imagined my retirement party would be the night I'd finally understand what betrayal truly felt like. After 35 years as a registered nurse, watching over patients, healing wounds, and comforting families in their darkest hours, I thought I deserved a celebration. Instead, I got a masterclass in cruelty served on a silver platter. The hospital conference room was decorated with blue and white streamers, my favorite colors. Colleagues who had become family over the decades filled the space with warm laughter and congratulations. The cake read, "Happy Retirement, Beulah," in elegant script, and for a moment, I felt genuinely happy. At 58, I was finally free to pursue the things I'd put on hold: gardening, reading, maybe even traveling like Gerald and I had always talked about. That's when I saw her. Freya, my daughter-in-law, glided into the room wearing a dress that made my heart stop. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it suited her perfectly, though it did. I froze because I recognized every delicate pearl button, every intricate lace detail, every fold of the midnight blue silk that caught the light just so. It was my mother's dress. The same dress Mom wore to her own retirement party 28 years ago, before cancer took her just 2 years later. The dress I'd carefully preserved in tissue paper and cedar, saving it for a special occasion. The dress I'd planned to wear tonight, until Freya had casually mentioned she had something special picked out and insisted I wear the safe beige outfit Gerald had bought me instead. My hands trembled as I gripped my champagne glass. She hadn't asked to borrow it. She'd simply taken it from my closet, from the garment bag where it hung like a sacred relic. The audacity was breathtaking, but what shattered me completely was the way she moved through the room, confident, radiant, as if she belonged in my mother's memory more than I did. "Doesn't Freya look stunning tonight?" Gerald appeared beside me, his voice warm with an admiration that used to be reserved for me. My husband of 30 years, the man who'd held me through my mother's funeral, who knew exactly what that dress meant to me, was practically glowing as he watched his son's wife work the room. I opened my mouth to tell him, to explain the significance, to ask how he could let this happen. But then I saw it. The look that passed between them when Freya caught his eye across the room. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it told a story that made my blood run cold. The slight tilt of her head. The way his eyes lingered on her face, then dropped to admire how the dress hugged her figure. The small secret smile they shared before quickly looking away, as if they'd been caught doing something they shouldn't. My champagne glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through my entire world. Several colleagues rushed over, concerned about the mess, about whether I was hurt. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at my husband and my daughter-in-law as the terrible truth settled into my bones like a cancer. They were having an affair. "Mom, are you okay?" My son David appeared at my side, his kind eyes full of worry. Sweet David, who'd inherited my compassionate nature and his father's steady reliability. David, who worked 2 jobs to support Freya's expensive tastes and had no idea his wife was destroying his family from the inside. "I'm fine, sweetheart," I managed, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass against my lips. Just clumsy, but I wasn't fine. As I watched Gerald's protective hand settle on Freya's lower back while she bent to examine the broken glass, as I saw the way she leaned into his touch for just a moment too long, I realized my entire life had been built on lies I'd been too trusting to see. The rest of the party passed in a blur of congratulations and well-wishes that felt hollow against the roar of betrayal in my ears. I smiled, I thanked people, I cut the cake with steady hands while my world crumbled around me. But all the while, I was cataloging details, filing away every glance, every touch, every moment of intimacy between my husband and the woman who'd married my son just 2 years ago. When Freya approached me near the end of the evening, wearing my mother's dress like a trophy, I thought she might apologize. might offer some explanation for the theft of my most precious possession. Instead, she smiled that sweet, innocent smile that had fooled us all. "I hope you don't mind about the dress, Beulah. I found it in your closet and it just called to me. Your mother had such exquisite taste." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. She knew exactly what she was doing, exactly what that dress meant, exactly how much it would hurt me to see her wearing it while she destroyed my family. This wasn't an accident or a thoughtless mistake. This was a message. I looked into her eyes, those clear blue eyes that had once seemed so innocent when David first brought her home, and saw something cold and calculating staring back at me. She wanted me to know. She wanted me to understand that she could take anything of mine she wanted, even my husband, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do about it. That's when I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. It was cream-colored, thick paper that felt substantial between my fingers. I'd been carrying it for weeks, waiting for the right moment, though I'd never imagined it would be this moment, in this place, with half my former colleagues still celebrating my retirement around us. "Gerald," I called softly, my voice cutting through the ambient conversation like a blade. He turned from where he'd been standing near the refreshment table, probably planning his next stolen moment with Freya. When he saw what I was holding, his face went completely white. "I think it's time you opened this." The room didn't fall silent all at once. It was more like dominoes falling, conversation stopping in waves as people noticed the tension crackling between us. Gerald's hands shook as he reached for the envelope, and I saw Freya's confident mask slip for just a moment, revealing the fear underneath. They thought I was the naive, devoted wife who would never suspect, never question, never fight back. They thought 35 years of caring for others had made me weak, had taught me only to nurture and forgive. They had no idea what they'd awakened. Gerald's trembling fingers fumbled with the envelope's edge, but I wasn't ready for him to open it yet. Not when the room was full of my colleagues. Not when David was standing there looking confused and concerned. This revelation required a more intimate setting, where the full weight of their betrayal could land properly. "Not here," I said quietly, taking the envelope back from his shaking hands. "This is a family matter." The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Gerald sat rigid in the passenger seat, stealing glances at me like I was a bomb that might explode at any moment. Freya and David followed in their car, and I could see her animated gestures in my rearview mirror as she probably tried to convince my son that his mother was having some kind of breakdown. She had no idea how carefully I'd planned this moment. It had started 6 months ago with something as simple as laundry. I was putting away Gerald's shirts when I found a receipt in his pocket. Dinner for 2 at Romano's, our special restaurant, on a Tuesday night when he'd told me he was working late. The meal cost $112, far more than Gerald would ever spend on a business dinner. At first, I made excuses. Maybe he'd taken a client out. Maybe he'd treated David to a nice meal. Maybe the receipt wasn't even from that Tuesday. But something nagged at me, the way things nag at a nurse when the symptoms don't quite add up to the obvious diagnosis. So I started paying attention. I noticed how Gerald's phone was always face down now, how he'd started showering as soon as he got home from work, how he'd suddenly developed an interest in fitness and bought new clothes without telling me. I watched how Freya's visits became more frequent after Gerald retired early last year, how she always seemed to time them for when David was at work. But the moment I knew, really knew, was 3 months ago when I came home early from my book club. Margaret had canceled at the last minute with a migraine, so instead of discussing Where the Crawdads Sing over wine and cheese, I found myself pulling into my own driveway at 7:30 on a Thursday evening. Gerald's car was there, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was seeing Freya's silver Honda parked around the corner, almost hidden behind the Johnson's oak tree. My heart hammered as I let myself into the house through the garage, moving as quietly as my nursing shoes would allow. I could hear voices from the living room, low, intimate, punctuated by laughter I'd never heard Gerald make with me. "She's so oblivious," Freya's voice drifted down the hallway, sweet and melodic, even while delivering poison. "Sometimes I think she actually enjoys being the martyred wife, always taking care of everyone else while her husband finds happiness elsewhere." Gerald's response was muffled, but I caught enough. After the retirement party. Won't have to pretend much longer. I stood frozen in my own hallway, listening to them plan the destruction of my life with the casual tone people use to discuss weekend plans. They talked about me like I was already gone, already erased from the equation of their future together. That night, after Freya left through the back door and Gerald pretended he'd been watching television alone all evening, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them in the heat of the moment. I wasn't going to scream or cry or beg. I was going to do what 35 years as a nurse had taught me to do: gather information, analyze the situation, and develop a treatment plan. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. His name was Marcus Webb, a former police detective who specialized in infidelity cases. He was kind but matter-of-fact, like the doctors I'd worked with who had to deliver devastating diagnoses with gentle professionalism. "I need to know everything," I told him during our first meeting at a coffee shop across town. "How long it's been going on, what they're planning, whether my son knows." Marcus was thorough. Within 2 weeks, he'd documented 17 separate meetings between Gerald and Freya. They met at hotels, restaurants, even in our own house when they thought I wouldn't be home. The photos were professionally shot, but devastating in their clarity. Gerald's hand on Freya's thigh at a restaurant booth, them kissing in the parking lot of the Marriott, Freya leaving our house at noon on a Tuesday when she'd told David she was shopping with friends. But Marcus uncovered something even worse than the affair itself. "Mrs. Morrison," he'd said during our final meeting, sliding a folder across the table with the careful precision of a surgeon delivering news about a terminal illness. "I think you need to see this." Inside were copies of documents I'd never seen before. Bank statements showing transfers from our joint savings account to an account in Freya's name only. Real estate documents transferring the deed of our house, the house Gerald and I had bought together 30 years ago, the house where we'd raised David, the house where I'd planned to spend my retirement, into Freya's sole ownership. Gerald had been systematically stealing my financial security and handing it to his mistress. "When were these transfers made?" I asked, my nurse's training keeping my voice steady even as my hands shook. "The house transfer was finalized 2 weeks ago," Marcus said gently. "The bank transfers have been happening gradually over the past 8 months, always amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic notifications. 8 months. Gerald had been planning to leave me for 8 months, carefully moving our assets out of my reach while I planned retirement parties and dreamed about traveling together." "There's more," Marcus continued, and I realized the folder was thicker than I'd first noticed. "Your daughter-in-law has been very busy. She's been meeting with a divorce attorney, getting advice on how to protect assets in the event of a marriage dissolution. The attorney specializes in cases where one spouse has significant assets that need to be preserved." The room spun around me. This wasn't just an affair born of passion or midlife crisis. This was a calculated business transaction, with me as the asset being liquidated. Now, sitting in our living room with Gerald, David, and Freya arranged like players in a drama they didn't know they were performing, I felt the weight of that knowledge like armor. They thought I was weak, gullible, easily discarded. They had no idea I'd spent months building a case against them with the same methodical precision I'd once used to track patient symptoms and medication schedules. Gerald kept glancing at the envelope in my hands, sweat beading on his forehead despite the air conditioning. "Beulah, maybe we should discuss this privately." "No," I said firmly. "David deserves to know what kind of woman he married. Don't you think it's time for some honesty in this family?" Freya's laugh was bright and artificial. "Really, Beulah, you're being dramatic. Whatever you think you know." I opened the envelope and pulled out the first photograph. Gerald and Freya kissing in the parking lot of the Comfort Inn, timestamp showing it was taken just last Tuesday while David was at work, and I was supposedly at my doctor's appointment. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, marking the seconds until everything changed forever. The photograph landed on the coffee table like a grenade with the pin pulled out. For a moment, nobody moved. David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, denial, and then a devastating understanding that made my heart break for him all over again. "Mom?" His voice was small, like when he was 7 and had found our neighbor's cat dead in our backyard. He was looking at me, not at the photo, not at his wife or his father, but at me, as if I could somehow make this not be real. Gerald lunged forward, his hand reaching for the photograph. "Beulah, you don't understand." "Don't." The word came out sharper than I'd intended, but it stopped him cold. I'd never used that tone with him before, never in 30 years of marriage. It was the voice I reserved for doctors who were about to make mistakes with my patients. The voice that had saved lives because it brooked no argument. Freya was the first to recover her composure, which told me everything I needed to know about how prepared she'd been for this moment. "David, honey, this isn't what it looks like. Your mother is obviously having some kind of breakdown. The stress of retirement, maybe early dementia." "Shut up." The words came from David, and they were so quiet, so deadly calm, that we all turned to stare at him. My gentle son, who'd never raised his voice to anyone in his life, was looking at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Just, "Shut up, Freya." He picked up the photograph with steady hands, studying it like he was trying to memorize every detail. The timestamp was clear: Tuesday, October 15th, 2:47 p.m. I knew he'd remember that date because it was the day he'd worked a double shift at the warehouse. The day Freya had told him she was spending the afternoon with her sister in Phoenix. "How long?" he asked, still staring at the photo. Gerald cleared his throat, trying to summon some version of the authority he'd once had in this house. "Son, this is between your mother and me. You don't need to—" I asked how long. David's voice was getting quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "How long have you been sleeping with my wife?" The silence stretched until it became unbearable. I could hear Mrs. Patterson's dog barking 3 houses down, could hear the hum of our refrigerator, could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. 8 months, I answered when it became clear neither of them would. "At least 8 months that I can prove." David's laugh was hollow, broken. "Our first anniversary was 9 months ago." He looked up at Freya, who had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "So you've been cheating on me for almost our entire marriage." "David, please let me explain," Freya started, but I cut her off by placing another document on the table. This one wasn't a photograph. It was a bank statement showing the transfer of $25,000 from our joint savings account to an account bearing only Freya's name. The date was 6 weeks ago, right after I'd mentioned wanting to take that cruise to Alaska we'd been talking about for years. Gerald's face went gray. "How did you get that?" "The same way I got these." I spread out more documents like I was dealing cards in a game where I held all the aces. Bank transfers totaling $87,000 over 8 months. Credit card statements showing expensive dinners, hotel rooms, jewelry purchases I'd never seen. And finally, the piece of paper that made Gerald sink into his chair like all the air had been let out of him. The deed transfer for our house. "You put our house in her name," I said, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my chest. "The house we bought together when David was 2 years old. The house where I've lived for 30 years. You signed it over to your son's wife without telling me." David stared at the deed transfer, his hands shaking now. "Dad, tell me this isn't real. Tell me you didn't steal Mom's house to give to the woman you're screwing." "It's not stealing," Gerald said weakly. "It's protecting assets. In case of divorce, the house would be safe." "Safe for who?" David's voice cracked. "Safe for the woman who's been lying to me since the day we got married? Safe for you and your mistress while Mom ends up with nothing?" Freya finally found her voice, though it came out shrill and desperate. "You don't understand the whole situation. Your father and I, we have a connection. We understand each other in ways that—" "You understand each other?" David was on his feet now, pacing like a caged animal. "You understand each other so well that you decided to steal from my mother? You understand each other so well that you've been meeting in hotel rooms while I work overtime to pay for your shopping trips?" I watched my son's world crumble in real time, and part of me regretted having to do this to him, but he deserved the truth. He deserved to know that the woman he'd pledged his life to had been calculating his destruction from the very beginning. "There's more," I said quietly, and 3 pairs of eyes turned to me with expressions of dread. Gerald's voice was barely a whisper. "More?" I reached into the envelope again, but this time I didn't pull anything out. I just held it there, letting them imagine what other secrets I might have uncovered, what other betrayals I'd documented with the same meticulous care I'd once used to chart patient recoveries. The house transfer can be reversed, I said, addressing Gerald directly. I know about it now, which means I can contest it. Fraudulent transfer of marital assets without spousal consent. My lawyer says it's a slam dunk case. Your lawyer? Freya's voice was sharp with fear now. Oh, yes. I've had legal representation for quite some time now. Amazing what you can accomplish when you're not wasting energy on a marriage that died 8 months ago. I leaned back in my chair, feeling calmer than I had in months. You see, I may have been naive about my husband's character, but I'm not stupid about my rights. Gerald tried one more time to regain control of the situation. Beulah, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers. We don't need to make this ugly. Ugly, I laughed, and it surprised me how genuine it sounded. Gerald, you've been systematically stealing from me for 8 months while sleeping with our daughter-in-law. You wore my mother's dress to my retirement party like some kind of trophy. How much uglier could this possibly get? That's when I saw something shift in Freya's expression. The mask of innocent confusion finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation underneath. She'd been caught, cornered, and now she was getting ready to fight back with whatever weapons she had left. You think you're so smart, she said, her voice dropping to something almost conversational. You think you've figured everything out, but you have no idea what you're really dealing with. David turned to stare at his wife, and I could see him recognizing something in her tone that he'd probably heard before but never understood. What's that supposed to mean? He asked. Freya's smile was razor sharp. It means your precious mother isn't the victim she's pretending to be. Tell them, Beulah. Tell them about the pills. My blood turned to ice. Freya's words hung in the air like poison gas, and I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came with being cornered by someone who thought they held a winning card. But after 35 years of nursing, I'd learned that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who underestimated what you knew about their weapons. The pills, she repeated, her voice gaining confidence as she watched my face. Go ahead, Beulah. Tell David and Gerald about your little prescription problem. David's face creased with confusion. What pills? Mom, what is she talking about? I could feel Gerald's eyes on me, probably wondering if his mistress had just handed him some kind of salvation from the wreckage of his exposed affair. But I kept my expression neutral, my hand steady, my voice calm. I think Freya should explain what she means, I said quietly, since she seems to know so much about it. Freya's smile widened, and I could see her preparing to deliver what she thought would be a killing blow. Your mother has been stealing medication from the hospital for months. Oxycodone, Percocet, Ativan. I caught her with a whole bottle of pills she'd taken from the pharmacy. She's been popping them like candy, probably selling them too. The accusation was so outrageous, so completely fabricated, that for a moment I almost laughed. Almost. But then I saw David's face, saw the seed of doubt that Freya's words had planted, and I realized this wasn't random desperation. This was a planned attack, something she'd been saving for exactly this moment. That's a serious accusation, Gerald said slowly, and I could hear the hope in his voice. If I was a drug addict, if I was a thief, then maybe he wasn't the monster in this story. Maybe I was just as bad as he was. It's also completely false, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out my phone. But interesting that you would know about it, Freya, since it never happened. Her confidence flickered for just a moment, but she pressed on. I have photos. I documented everything because I was worried about you. Because I thought David should know his mother was. Show me. The simple request stopped her cold. What? Show me the photos. Show me this evidence you supposedly have of me stealing medication. I held up my phone. Because I have photos too. Would you like to see them? I swiped to the first image. Freya at CVS Pharmacy, talking to a young man behind the counter. The timestamp showed it was from 2 months ago during one of her supposed shopping trips with friends. That's Tommy Hendricks, I said conversationally. He's a pharmacy technician at CVS. He's also been selling prescription medications illegally for the past year. I know this because I reported him to the DEA 3 weeks ago. The color drained from Freya's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. See, the interesting thing about being a nurse for 35 years is that you develop a network. Other nurses, doctors, pharmacists, medical investigators, we talk to each other. We share information about suspicious activities, about people who might be abusing the system. I swiped to the next photo, showing Freya exchanging money for a small bottle. When someone starts asking questions about my prescription habits, I tend to hear about it. David was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Freya, what the hell is she talking about? Tommy Hendricks has been very cooperative with the DEA investigation, I continued, my voice still calm, still professional. He's provided a complete list of his illegal sales over the past year. Freya's name appears 18 times, purchasing oxycodone and Percocet without valid prescriptions. Total street value of approximately $4,000. Gerald looked like he was going to be sick. That's a federal crime. Yes, it is. But here's the really interesting part. I swiped to another photo, this one showing Freya meeting with a different man in a parking lot. Freya wasn't just buying pills for personal use, she was reselling them. Marcus, my private investigator, followed her to several transactions. She's been dealing drugs to pay for those expensive dinners and hotel rooms with my husband. The silence in the room was absolute. David had sunk into a chair, his head in his hands. Gerald was staring at Freya like she was a stranger, which, in many ways, she was. "That's not," Freya started, but her voice came out as a whisper. "That's not what, sweetheart?" I asked, and the endearment came out like acid. "Not true? Not what you planned to happen? Not how you expected this evening to go?" I stood up, moving to the window and looking out at the neighborhood I'd called home for 30 years. The neighborhood Gerald had tried to steal from me. You see, when I hired Marcus to investigate the affair, I told him to find out everything. Not just about the adultery, but about who you really are, Freya. What kind of person seduces her father-in-law and systematically destroys a family? The drug dealing was actually a surprise, I continued, turning back to face them. I thought you were just a simple gold digger. I had no idea you were this entrepreneurial. David finally looked up, his face ravaged. "Is this why you married me? To get close to Dad? To get access to Mom's money?" Freya's mask was completely gone now, replaced by something cold and calculating. "Your father is a weak, pathetic man who was desperate for attention from a younger woman. And your mother is a naive fool who trusted everyone around her. You're all so easy to manipulate it's almost boring." The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. She wasn't even pretending anymore, wasn't even trying to salvage the situation. She was just letting us see who she really was underneath all the sweet smiles and devoted wife act. "But you made one mistake," I said, pulling out the final document from my envelope. "You assumed I would never fight back. You assumed 35 years of caring for other people had made me weak." The document was a restraining order, signed by a judge that morning. "Effective immediately, you're banned from coming within 500 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. Any violation will result in immediate arrest." Freya snatched the paper from my hands, scanning it with wild eyes. "You can't do this. I live here. David can make his own choices about his marriage," I said, "but you will not be making those choices in my house. Because yes, it's still my house." The fraudulent deed transfer was voided this afternoon. My lawyer filed an emergency motion based on the evidence of your criminal activities and conspiracy to commit fraud. Gerald finally found his voice. "Beulah, please. We can work this out. We can go to counseling. No, Gerald, we can't." I looked at the man I'd spent 30 years loving, the man I'd trusted with my future, my security, my heart. Because this isn't about passion or midlife crisis or growing apart. This is about you choosing to systematically destroy me for a woman who deals drugs and marries people for money. I gathered up the photographs and documents, sliding them back into the envelope with steady hands. "I'll be staying at my sister's house tonight. Gerald, you have 24 hours to move your belongings out of my house. After that, you'll be trespassing." "Where will I go?" he asked, and for the first time since this started, he sounded like the man I'd once loved, lost, confused, frightened. "I really don't care," I said, and meant it. "Maybe Freya can share her jail cell with you. I'm sure you'll figure something out." As I walked toward the door, Freya called after me, her voice sharp with desperation. You think you've won something? You think destroying your own family makes you strong? I turned back one last time, looking at this woman who had tried to steal my life, who had thought I was too weak and too trusting to fight back. I didn't destroy this family, Freya. I saved what was left of it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my sister Carol's spare bedroom, staring out at her garden while my phone buzzed with increasingly desperate messages from Gerald. By 3 a.m., they'd escalated from apologies to threats to pathetic pleas for forgiveness. I deleted each one without reading past the first line. At dawn, I made coffee and called Marcus. It's done, I told him when he answered on the second ring. They know about the affair, the money transfers, Freya's drug dealing. Gerald's moving out today. How did they take it? His voice was gentle, professional. Over the past months, he'd become more than just an investigator. He'd become a friend, someone who understood what it felt like to have your world systematically dismantled by people you trusted. About as well as you'd expect. But Marcus, there's something else. Something I didn't tell them last night because I wanted to process it first. There was a pause. The pregnancy test. You knew? I suspected. Freya's been visiting an obstetrician in Scottsdale, Dr. Sarah Chen. I have the appointment records going back 3 months. My hands tightened around the coffee mug. 3 months. The timing made my stomach turn. How far along? Based on the frequency of appointments and some medical records I was able to access, approximately 4 months. 4 months meant conception in June. June, when Gerald and I had gone to marriage counseling, when he'd held my hand and promised we could work through our problems, when he'd made love to me and whispered that we'd figure out how to reconnect in retirement. He'd been getting his son's wife pregnant while lying to my face about saving our marriage. There's more, Marcus continued, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Hospital records show this isn't Freya's first pregnancy. She had an abortion 2 years ago, about 6 months before she married David. The timeline hit me like a physical blow. Gerald, the medical records don't specify paternity, but the timing suggests it's possible. If that's true, then Gerald and Freya's relationship predates her marriage to your son by at least 6 months. I set down my coffee cup before my shaking hands could drop it. This wasn't an affair that had developed over time. This was a calculated, long-term plan. Freya had gotten pregnant by Gerald, terminated the pregnancy, then married David as cover while continuing her relationship with his father. I need those medical records, I said, already on their way to your lawyer. Beulah, I have to ask, what are you planning to do with this information? I looked out at Carol's garden, at the roses she'd been tending for 20 years, at the life she'd built with patience and care and honest work. I'm going to finish what I started. David called me at 8 a.m., his voice hollow with exhaustion. Mom, can we talk? There are things I need to tell you. We met at a diner on the edge of town, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the waitresses had seen enough of life not to ask questions about why a woman and her son both looked like they'd been through a war. She's pregnant, David said without preamble, staring into his coffee like it might hold answers. 4 months, she told me last night after you left. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. I know, sweetheart. He looked up, surprised. You know, I hired an investigator, remember? He's very thorough. I took a breath, steeling myself for what I had to tell him. David, there's something else. Something about the timeline of Freya's relationship with your father. I watched my son's face as I explained about the previous pregnancy, about the medical records, about the possibility that Gerald and Freya's affair had been going on for over 2 years. With each revelation, something inside him seemed to break a little more. So she never loved me, he said finally. Not even at the beginning. I was just, what? Cover? A way to get closer to Dad? I don't know what was in her heart, I said honestly, but I know the facts. And the facts suggest this was never about love. David laughed bitterly. You know what's funny? I actually thought about having kids with her. I brought it up a few months ago, said maybe we should start trying, and she got so angry. Said we weren't ready, that we needed to establish ourselves first. Now I know she was already carrying Dad's baby. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. This was my child, my gentle, trusting son who'd never hurt anyone in his life. and these people had used him like a pawn in their twisted game. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you decide what kind of life you want to have," I said. "Independent of them. Independent of their choices. You're 28 years old, David. You have time to build something real with someone who actually loves you. And Dad?" I thought about Gerald, about 30 years of marriage, about the man I'd thought I knew and the stranger who'd been stealing from me for months. "Your father made his choices. Now he gets to live with the consequences." That afternoon, I drove to the house I'd shared with Gerald for 3 decades. His car was gone, but Freya's Honda was parked in the driveway like she still belonged there. The restraining order said she couldn't come within 500 feet of me, but apparently she was testing the boundaries. I called the police before I got out of my car. Officer Martinez arrived within 10 minutes. A young woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. "Ma'am, do you want to press charges?" "I want her arrested," I said simply. "The restraining order is clear." Freya emerged from the house as the officer approached, her belly showing just enough to make her pregnancy obvious. She'd probably been hoping the sight of it would make me emotional, would make me reconsider destroying the mother of my grandchild. She'd miscalculated again. "This is harassment," Freya called out as Officer Martinez reached for her handcuffs. "I'm pregnant. You can't arrest a pregnant woman for visiting her mother-in-law. Actually, I can arrest you for violating a restraining order," Officer Martinez replied calmly. "The condition of your pregnancy doesn't exempt you from legal consequences." As they led Freya to the patrol car, she turned back to me with one last desperate attempt at manipulation. "That baby is your grandchild, Beulah. Gerald's child. Are you really going to let your own grandchild grow up without family?" I looked at this woman who'd spent months destroying my life, who'd stolen my husband, my money, my security, and who now wanted to use an unborn child as a weapon against me. "That child will have all the family it needs," I said quietly. "Just not you." Later that evening, Gerald finally came home. I was waiting for him in the living room, surrounded by the boxes I'd packed with his belongings. He looked older somehow, diminished, like a man who'd finally understood the true cost of his choices. "The police called," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They said Freya was arrested, violating a restraining order. She'll be out on bail tomorrow, but she's officially been charged with a crime now, along with the drug-dealing charges that are coming." He slumped into what used to be his favorite chair, the chair where he'd watched football on Sundays while I made dinner, where he'd held David as a baby, where we'd planned our retirement just months ago. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said. "What did you mean, Gerald? When you started sleeping with our daughter-in-law? When you put our house in her name? When you got her pregnant while lying to my face about working on our marriage?" He flinched at each accusation. "I was confused, lost. You were always so focused on work, on other people, and Freya made me feel young, important, like you mattered." I shook my head. "Gerald, I spent 35 years putting other people first. Patience, you, David, this family. The one time I tried to focus on something for myself, my retirement, our future together, you decided to throw it all away for a woman who was using you. She loves me," he said weakly. I pulled out one final document from the envelope that had started this whole confrontation. "No, Gerald, she doesn't." It was a recording transcript, conversations between Freya and her drug dealer boyfriend, the one Marcus had photographed her with. Conversations where she'd laughed about the pathetic old man who was so easy to manipulate, who believed everything she told him, who was handing over his wife's money like a trained dog. Gerald read it in silence, his face growing paler with each line. When he finished, he looked up at me with eyes full of something that might have been regret. "I've lost everything, haven't I?" "Yes," I said simply. "You have. What about the baby?" I stood up, smoothing down my skirt, preparing to leave the house that was mine again, the life that was mine again. "That's between you and Freya, and whatever lawyer she can afford after the drug charges. I'm done being responsible for the mess you've made." As I reached the door, Gerald called after me one last time. "Beulah, please. We were married for 30 years. That has to count for something." I turned back to look at him, really look at him, one final time. It did count for something, Gerald. It counted for everything. But you threw it away for a woman who never loved you, who used you to destroy your own family, who's carrying your child as her final insurance policy against the consequences of her crimes. I picked up my purse, the same purse that had held the envelope that changed everything. 30 years counted for everything until you decided they counted for nothing. Now you get to live with that choice. 6 months later, I stood in the garden behind my house, legally and completely mine again, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The roses I'd planted years ago had never bloomed better, as if they too were celebrating their freedom from the toxic atmosphere that had poisoned this place for so long. The legal proceedings had been swift and decisive. Freya's drug-dealing charges had led to a plea bargain that included jail time and restitution. Gerald's fraudulent transfer of assets had been completely reversed, and he'd been forced to return every penny he'd stolen from our joint accounts, plus interest and legal fees. The house, the savings, the retirement funds I'd worked 35 years to build, all of it was mine again. More importantly, my life was mine again. David had filed for divorce the day after Freya's arrest. The process had been complicated by her pregnancy, but my son had shown a strength I'd never seen in him before. He'd refused to be manipulated by tears or threats, had refused to let the fact of the baby cloud his judgment about the woman who'd destroyed his family. "I can't raise a child with someone I don't trust," he'd told me during one of our weekly coffee dates, "and I can't trust someone who's capable of what she did to you, to Dad, to all of us." The baby had been born in February, a little girl that Gerald had wanted to name Hope, as if her existence could somehow redeem the circumstances of her conception. Freya had chosen differently. She'd named her daughter Madison and made it clear that Gerald's parental rights would depend entirely on his willingness to support them financially. It was a form of poetic justice that Gerald, who'd spent months stealing my money to fund his affair, was now trapped in a situation where he'd be paying for that affair for the next 18 years. I hadn't seen the baby. I'd made peace with the fact that this child, while technically my step-grandchild, was a product of the destruction of my family rather than an addition to it. Maybe someday, when she was older and could understand the complicated circumstances of her birth, we might have a relationship. But for now, my energy was focused on rebuilding rather than managing the wreckage others had created. Gerald had moved to a small apartment across town, close enough to visit his daughter, but far enough away that I didn't have to see him unless I chose to. He'd aged dramatically in the months since our confrontation, as if the weight of his choices had settled into his bones. Sometimes David would mention seeing him at the grocery store or the gas station, and he always looked, in David's words, like a man who'd lost a war he'd started himself. I felt no satisfaction in his misery, but I felt no sympathy either. He'd made his choices with full knowledge of what they would cost, and now he was learning that some prices could never be fully paid. The most unexpected development had been my relationship with Marcus Webb, the private investigator who'd helped me uncover the truth about my marriage. What had started as a professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, something neither of us had been looking for but both of us had been ready to find. Marcus understood betrayal in ways that most people couldn't. His own marriage had ended when he'd discovered his wife's affair with his former police partner, and he'd channeled his pain into a career helping other people find the truth about their own lives. We shared a dark sense of humor about human nature, a hard-earned wisdom about the things people were capable of when they thought no one was watching. "You know what I love about you?" he'd said over dinner the previous week, in the Italian restaurant where we'd started meeting after my case was closed. "You didn't let them make you bitter. You got angry. You got even. You got justice. But you didn't let them poison you." He was right, though it had taken me months to realize it myself. I'd expected to feel more broken than I did, more damaged by the revelation that 30 years of marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. Instead, I felt lighter, cleaner, like I'd finally been able to wash off dirt I hadn't even known I was carrying. The retirement I'd planned with Gerald, the traveling, the hobbies, the quiet domestic bliss, had been replaced by something better. I'd started volunteering at a free clinic downtown, using my nursing skills to help people who couldn't afford healthcare. I'd joined a book club where we actually discussed books instead of gossip. I'd learned to cook for one without feeling lonely, had learned to make decisions without consulting anyone else, had learned to sleep through the night without listening for someone else's breathing. At 58, I'd discovered what it felt like to live for myself. David had moved into a small house just 10 minutes away, close enough for our weekly dinners but far enough away that we both had space to heal. He'd started dating again, cautiously, but with a new awareness of red flags he'd missed the first time around. The woman he'd been seeing for the past 2 months was a teacher named Rebecca, someone who made him laugh and didn't seem to have any hidden agendas or complicated family dynamics. "She's nothing like Freya," he'd told me with obvious relief. "She pays for her own dinners. She doesn't ask me to buy her things. And she actually seems to like me for who I am instead of what I can give her." It was a low bar, but it was progress. On this particular morning, as I deadheaded roses and pulled weeds from the flower beds that were finally thriving again, I heard a car pull into my driveway. Through the gate, I could see Marcus's truck, and I smiled despite myself. He'd taken to bringing me coffee on weekend mornings, not because I needed him to, but because he wanted to, because it made both of us happy in a simple, uncomplicated way. "Morning, beautiful," he called as he came through the garden gate, carrying 2 cups from the coffee shop downtown. "How are the roses?" "Spectacular," I said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "I think they're as happy to be free of the drama as I am." We sat on the porch swing Gerald had installed years ago, back when he'd still been the man I thought I'd married. I'd considered having it removed, erasing all traces of him from my space, but I'd decided instead to reclaim it. This was my house, my porch, my swing. I wouldn't let his betrayal rob me of enjoying the good things just because he'd once been part of them. "Any word from your lawyer about Freya's appeal?" Marcus asked. "Denied. She'll serve the full 18 months. I sipped my coffee, watching a pair of cardinals build a nest in the oak tree Gerald had always threatened to cut down because he thought it blocked too much sunlight. Her lawyer tried to argue that the pregnancy and new baby were mitigating circumstances, but Judge Patterson wasn't buying it. Marcus chuckled. "Judge Patterson has 3 daughters. She doesn't have much patience for women who prey on families. Good thing I didn't know that when I hired you to investigate. I might have been tempted to take justice into my own hands." "You did take justice into your own hands," Marcus said seriously. "You just did it legally, methodically, and completely. It was actually beautiful to watch, in a terrifying sort of way." I leaned back against the swing cushions, feeling the morning sun warm my face. "You know what the strangest part is? I'm grateful it happened." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Grateful? Not grateful for the betrayal, not grateful for the pain, but grateful that I found out who Gerald really was before I wasted any more years on him. Grateful that I discovered I was stronger than I thought. Grateful that I learned the difference between being alone and being lonely." I gestured toward the garden, toward the house that was finally peaceful, toward the life I'd built from the ashes of the one that had been stolen from me. If Gerald had been a better liar, if Freya had been smarter about hiding her tracks, I might have spent the rest of my life married to a man who didn't love me, supporting a family that saw me as nothing more than a source of money and free labor. Instead, I'm 58 years old, and I finally know what it feels like to be valued for who I am rather than what I can provide. I reached over and took his hand, marveling at how simple and uncomplicated it felt to care about someone who cared about me in return. "I'm grateful for that knowledge, even if it came at a terrible price." Marcus squeezed my hand gently. "So, what happens next?" I thought about the question, about the future that stretched ahead of me like an unwritten book. For 30 years, my future had been tied to Gerald's choices, Gerald's dreams, Gerald's timeline. Now it was mine alone to write. "Next, I live," I said simply. "I wake up every morning in a house that belongs to me. I make decisions based on what makes me happy, and I never again mistake someone's need for me with their love for me." "That sounds like a pretty good plan." "It is," I agreed, watching the cardinals work together to weave twigs and bits of string into something that would shelter their family. "It's the best plan I've ever made." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, burning off the last of the morning mist, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete peace with my choices. The envelope that had started everything was long gone, its contents having served their purpose. The documents were filed away in my lawyer's office. The photographs were evidence in closed legal cases. The truth had been told, and justice had been served. What remained was this: a woman who'd learned that betrayal, while devastating, wasn't necessarily permanent. That trust, once broken, could be rebuilt with people who deserved it. That love, real love, was possible even after you'd discovered that what you'd thought was love was actually something much smaller and more selfish. At 58, I was finally free to find out who I was when I wasn't busy being what everyone else needed me to be. It was the most beautiful discovery of my life. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.